Welcome to Coffee with Kusari. I'm Ben Cotton, and this time I'm joined by Mike Lieberman, co-founder and CTO of Kusari. Mike, you and I just got back from Open Source Summit Europe in Amsterdam, and a lot of the conversation there, unsurprisingly, was about the CRA. What have you noticed that has changed in some of those conversations, say, compared to a year ago?
So, for folks who are not super familiar, CRA, Cyber Resilience Act, comes from Europe. It pretty much, if you're outside the U.S., you've probably heard about it. A lot of the folks we've been talking to from Asia as well as Europe, and the sort of surrounding territories and stuff like that, surrounding geography, like there's a lot of stuff that is being talked about with CRA. And the way I would sort of compare it to, let's say, not even just a year ago, but just KubeCon London, whatever that was back in March, April, somewhere around then. Before, I think a lot of folks were sort of viewing CRA as this thing that was very, very far away. I think folks are starting to see it being a lot more immediate. Some of those pieces do go into effect, like the vulnerability stuff, around this time next year, maybe a little bit before. And we're starting to see folks, especially in Europe, now saying, okay, great, we have plans in place to comply with the CRA as soon as like on day one. Like the folks are building those plans. They're worried about a lack of tooling, a lack of guidance. They're still very, very worried about that, but they do have plans in place. The thing that is still concerning is a lot of U.S. companies still are looking at this as my lawyer will deal with that. A lot of companies need to recognize that this is more like the GDPR, right? Where this will have big impacts. You will get fined. You will be potentially blocked from doing business in Europe if you do not comply with this. And so we're still seeing some American companies still sort of struggling with, this is a real thing. This is not like some of the back and forth that you see with more optional sort of compliance rules here in the States. So with that said, again, we've seen a lot more progress there. And I think one of the biggest areas that have progressed has been around the frameworks and the standards that are being built to comply with the CRA, like OpenSSF baseline.
So I think you bring up a really good point, right? The CRA doesn't just apply to companies that are based or that operate in Europe. They apply to any manufacturer who wants to sell a project with digital elements in the European Union. Do you feel like the Europe-based companies are, still a lot further ahead than, companies in the UK or the US or elsewhere?
So definitely the U.S. They're way further ahead, and of course U.S. based EU based companies are obviously probably gonna be a bit more prepared. But the other ones that I also found very interesting is every time I talk to a company that's based out of Asia, whether it's South Korea or Japan, they seem to really have their act together. Talking to folks out there, they're regularly talking about, we're having monthly workshops about what's the latest update on CRA. How can we prepare for this? In the US, there's folks who are talking about it just sort of very broadly saying, yeah, we probably have to figure something out eventually. But they view this as something that is still very far off, still maybe won't become a thing. Maybe it'll get delayed indefinitely. And again, like some of this comes from the U.S., where a lot of these regulatory, and compliance often get watered down a little bit, often get delayed for a really long time, or in some cases where the fines are considered more acceptable than just paying the fine is cheaper than compliance. But it's going to be very different, I think, with this, especially given that some of the fines on a company as small as, Kusari is on the order of millions of dollars per violation. And then on an organization that's like, let's say, a multinational corporation that sells Internet of Things devices like, refrigerators and whatever, that could be upwards of half a billion or more per violation. And hey, that actually is real money that does cause a lot of harm to an organization, even something even as large as some of the largest organizations in the world. And so I do view that you know Europe and Asia are very much in line. They're going to be ready. I'm pretty sure the UK, a lot of organizations in the UK will also be ready. I'm worried more about sort of US organizations that I think are just going to be a little bit caught unprepared because they don't have eyes into the EU as much as those other folks do.
So, for the companies that maybe haven't been taking it seriously enough yet, where do you suggest they start to play catch up before the rules come into effect?
Surprisingly, the CRA, the text of the CRA is not super long. I think you know an average executive could kind of read through most of it and get a decent idea. Now, again, I'm not your lawyer. I'm not a lawyer at all. I would recommend reaching out to lawyers who work in the European space and get their sort of feedback on what needs to actually happen. And be prepared, right? So, starting next year, you will have to submit all sort of vulnerabilities that if you're selling a product with digital elements, which, is pretty much most software would be considered a product with digital elements, including, SaaSes that have some sort of element that interacts with it. So like, a CLI tool or something like that. And I think the thing is going to be, reach out to your lawyers, kind of get some guidance there, but also stay ahead of things. So look at the work that's being done in organizations like the OpenSSF, but also in organizations like the Eclipse Foundation and other sort of open source organizations, because they're looking at this also from the perspective of how do they make this very easy for their members to comply with the CRA. Because again, the CRA has a lot of elements in there that are focused on open source. And they view pretty much, again, all software, all dependencies, etc. If you're selling it, you are responsible for it. So if there's something that's in open source, you are still going to be responsible for ensuring that it's safe for your customers to use. You can't pass the buck on to unpaid maintainers. And I think the challenge is going to be for a lot of organizations is how do I kind of approach that? And I think the way you approach that is, well, obviously large organizations are coming to Eclipse, to the Linux Foundation, and so on, saying, hey, we are worried about doing this. And as opposed to each one of us figuring out how to manage open source ourselves, can we look at the Linux Foundation, Eclipse, etc., to be building the patterns by which we can approach safe and secure open source? So I still take, like, those organizations are still taking on the liability, but the amount of effort they have to put in to figure it out is going to be lowered because a lot of that heavy lifting will be done by organizations like the LF in building these patterns out.
I remember when the CRA was first being discussed, there was a lot of concern like this is going to kill open source because it's an unreasonable burden on maintainers. And European regulators have done a really good job of responding to those concerns and, making sure the liability was on the commercial or entities, not the volunteer maintainers. Do you feel like the open source community now kind of understands what their role or what their place in the CRA landscape is, or do you feel like there's still more education needed there?
I think some folks are getting it. I think that you still have some folks who are very paranoid of that. The EU is going to start fining, John Smith, a developer on like a small little project, millions of dollars, because it turns out that small project was used by some large multinational bank, and that large multinational bank, there was a vulnerability in that piece of software, and it got compromised, and they're going to come after this open source developer who does this on the weekend. That has been made sure, there has been a lot of work being done to make sure that folks recognize that they're not going after those folks. If you're not selling anything, you are not considered a manufacturer, and therefore you are not, you don't have obligations under the CRA. I think an area where there is a lot of confusion, and there's still a lot of confusion, is when does an open source maintainer become potentially a manufacturer? Because if I'm working on an open source project and somebody, donates a couple of bucks to me to buy a coffee or buy a beer, am I now all of a sudden a maintainer because I've accepted money? Probably not. But it's unclear where the line comes from. Like, okay, well, I'm now doing it on the weekends and I accept money on the weekends, and now it's actually my primary job. Like, oh, am I now very much a maintainer? I mean, no, sorry, manufacturer? Most likely. So there is some vagaries around when somebody kind of turns into a manufacturer, and that still needs to be kind of clarified a bit more. And I think right now, the expectation is that will be litigated in the courts, that we probably won't have a great answer around that. But the thing that, again, I've been told, at least from lots of folks in this space, is we probably won't see, again, any sort of cases being brought against, again, somebody who's making a few bucks on the weekend on this. We're going to see them going after your giant multinational organizations first, because, again, that's where the money is from, like, even if they were to go after you, like, the benefit of going after you is, like, they're not going to be getting money out of somebody who does this on the weekends anyway, right? The cost of litigating somebody who made a mistake is just not worth it compared to a multinational, giant, multi-trillion-dollar company that it's like, yeah, we can fine them billions of dollars, and that's worth the money, that's worth the time and effort for these folks in the EU to go after, versus, again, just your average developer who's like trying their best and doesn't, maybe, oops, I didn't dot an I or cross a T here, I didn't realize.
So, let's bring this back to the commercial side. How can Kusari help people get ready for CRA compliance?
Again, on the main requirement that's coming up next year, around vulnerability disclosure, right? Our sort of, both inspector and platform both have a bunch of stuff in there to both detect vulnerabilities, but also makes it very easy for folks to disclose those vulnerabilities, and also provide things like VEX documents for stuff like, hey, I'm actually not vulnerable to this particular vulnerability, which is also another thing that is part of that, is like, hey, yes, there is that vulnerability because of a dependency we use, but we have determined that it's not actually exploitable, don't need to patch it, that sort of stuff. In addition to that, I don't want to spoil too much, but there's some features that will be coming out soon around things like OpenSSF baseline and some of the other stuff. So around understanding your project health, and the health of the software you write, and saying, hey, are you doing the right things from a compliance standpoint, that if you had to disclose things to the EU government or any sort of government about, we have a vulnerability management process in place, things like that. We have a bunch of work that is happening there that will also help remediate where there might be deficiencies in those processes, and help you automate them so you don't actually have to spend a lot of time and effort yourself. Yeah, I think like there's going to be a bunch of stuff there, and then also looking at the products you yourself consume, right? Doing background checks on all the open source software you consume to say, hey, are these open source projects, do they have vulnerability disclosure processes, and do they have a security process? Do they have multiple maintainers and so on, to help you understand the risk of pulling in open source software, right? It's, a lot of folks view, there's the old saying, open source is free as in puppy, not free as in, beer, right? Like, open source is not just, oh my gosh, whatever I want, I can get it for free. It's no. You can take this free thing, but you still have to take care of it. You still have to understand how it fits into what you're doing. And we can help you answer that question, right? We can't go and magically make a new maintainer for some library that you use, but we can tell you, hey, did you know that this library has a couple of vulnerabilities and it hasn't been maintained in a year, and it appears that this person has abandoned the project, and it's still up to you to now move off of that, but we make that easier for you to move off of. We help provide suggestions on things like, hey, don't use this library, use this library, it's better maintained, and help folks understand that. And I think it's really about understanding what you have is kind of one of the biggest things. And then, obviously all the other things on top there of like providing suggestions on what code would need to be changed to sort of move off of the vulnerable version to an updated version, or move off of the deprecated thing into the new thing.
All right, thanks for joining us, Mike, and we'll see you all next time on Coffee with Kusari.